Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, and welcome back to True Drew Podcast. Today, for episode 78, we are going to be talking about the Swami's ring. I've got my sweet tea next to me. The sun is coming in through this window where I like to do my podcasting. It's just the perfect day to do a podcast episode, so I hope you guys are excited for this one. Also, this is so cool. I got to meet another member of the Clue Crew in real life this past week. I got to meet Lynn. Lynn, if you're listening, hi. I had so much fun getting to show you around my hometown and getting to talk about Nancy Drew. So the Swami's Ring is book number 61 in the Nancy Drew original series, and it came out in 1981. So I was able to find 4 separate book covers for the Swami's Ring, and I've seen 2 of these in person. The other 2 I've never seen. So the first cover edition that I've got to talk about today, and as always, these are posted on my Instagram on Wednesdays before these episodes come out, which is True Drew Podcast. But we have Nancy on the right side of this window-looking kind of cutout, because this is one of the Wanderer edition prints, and she's holding a ring. It looks a little bit like a class ring, and there's a guy scaling this rocky mountainside coming towards her, and 2 other people leaning down looking at him. So that cover edition is probably the most common one that I've seen for the Swami's Ring. This second book cover shows Nancy, and the book itself is like a light green color, and she's in the woods, and she's got like a collared shirt on. She's got really blonde hair here, kind of highlighted looking, and there's a man in the woods behind her with like a beard and mustache, and I'm pretty sure I know which character this is supposed to be from the book, but he's kind of looks like he's sneaking up on her. This cover edition also has a tagline. It says, "An unusual ring has Nancy running in circles. What secret will the unusual ring reveal?" Now this third cover I've never actually seen in person before, but the book itself is red, and Nancy is what stands out to me on this cover. The rest of the background is black, and we just have Nancy with her magnifying glass looking at this ring, and it's just very cool. It makes me think of the earlier books, like where Nancy's silhouette is on the cover in orange, and this just really makes Nancy the focus on this cover. I mean, it's very basic, but it does interest me because I've never seen it before, and I look for Nancy Drew books all the time. If you all know me, I love collecting the different cover variations, so I'm going to have to keep an eye out for this one for my own personal collection, but also for my shop where I sell the books, truedrewpodcast.com. Now, the fourth and final cover edition for the Swami's Ring, I believe this is a UK edition, and it has the Swami's Ring listed as number 55, so a little bit different because the American version is number 61, but Nancy has short, very scraggly looking hair. It just looks like she's taken some hairspray to her hair, I guess, but she's got the fringed bangs. And on this cover we have a very cool looking sports car, Nancy tied up, a snake slithering across the bottom of the cover, and 2 people running away from a house. So I don't know, if I had to pick a favorite out of this grouping, I would probably pick number 2 or number 3. I don't know, I just like the colors and the overall look to those. I just really like in the third one especially where Nancy is just the focus. It's kind of neat. Now, as far as a funny cover spoof goes for the Swami's Ring, I just came up with Nancy Drew in the case of who lost their class ring on this nature hike, because in the first cover especially, we've got people scaling a mountain. Nancy's got this ring, and it just looks like they went on a hike and then they just found some jewelry. So overall, giving these a cover rating score, I would probably give these covers a 2.5 to 3 magnifying glass score. I love the color of Nancy's hair in the first cover, but otherwise, it's not my favorite. So now let's go ahead and discuss some of the characters we encounter in the Swami's Ring. So up first we have Prim Nath, Dev Singh, Mr. Hillier, who is the festival manager. There's a music festival going on in town. Lisa Scotty, who is Nancy's friend and a nurse. Cliff, who is an amnesia patient. Mr. Javari, who is a jeweler. Dr. Randolph, who's the director of Rosemont Hospital, Mr. Keshav Lal, who is a hotel owner, Tommy Johnson, Nancy's neighbor, Miss Angela Pruitt, who is a harpist, Dr. De Niro, an anthropologist, Phyllis, who is Miss Pruitt's sister, the Flannerys, who are these people that Phyllis stayed with, Rama Swami, and Brady Tilson. Wow, I should have gave you guys a heads up. There are a lot more characters than I remembered from reading this. This was hard to keep track of some of these people. I do love that Tommy Johnson, Nancy's neighbor, is in this book, though, because he's been in a lot of the books. He was in some of the earlier original books, like somewhere between 1 and 56. He gets into a lot of mischief, but he also helps Nancy sometimes. Like, I think he identified one of the bad guys in Nancy's Mysterious Letter, if I remember correctly. Oh, I was right. He was in Nancy's Mysterious Letter. I have a good memory sometimes. So now I'll go ahead and read a quick synopsis for the Swami's Ring. Nancy has been told by Carson she can't help with his theater case, but she helps anyway, picking up another case along the way involving a ring, an amnesia patient, and a religious retreat where a Swami is said to be. Can Nancy solve all these mysteries in one? And here's a quick newspaper headline synopsis for the Swami's Ring. Drew's exonerated in theater case and religious retreat scam busted. More at 11. I feel like after reading some of these newspaper headline synopses, I can't talk, I need to say, back to you, Todd, or somebody. I feel like a reporter. But anyways, we're going to get to some of the direct quotes and notes for this one. I wrote down a ton for this one, and I know I say that about every book, but this one in particular, I think I wrote down like 7 or 8 pages worth of stuff, so here we go. So this note is going to be of particular interest to you if you listen to my bonus Halloween episodes back last year. So Nancy has a friend that she went to school with. Her name is Lisa Scotty, and she appeared in the Ghost Stories book number 2 that we talked about around Halloween. And she's actually in this book. She has a mystery for Nancy to solve. And I don't know, I just get really excited when there's recurring characters in the Nancy Drew books, like not just Bess and George, but these little side characters that come back, because it just shows that they were paying attention. I love when the ghost writers keep that continuity throughout the series, and I don't know, I just like to check in on these people. Like, I just wonder what they're doing, because they were in this book and we don't see them for like 5, 6, 10 books, and yeah, I just want to know for personal reasons. It's kind of like looking up that person that you went to high school with on Facebook. Like, you guys may not have even talked that much, but you're just like, I just want to know what you're up to. How's life treating you? So Lisa Scotty has this mystery for Nancy to solve, and there was a man who was found in the woods where he fell off of a cliff, or he could have been pushed. We're not really positive on that right now, but he has amnesia. He doesn't know who he is, where he was going, anything, but the nurses at Rosemont Hospital have nicknamed him, get this, Cliff. I don't know. I just was like, this could be, good for them, because they're just like, well, we don't know this guy's name. We're just going to give him a name. It's going to be Cliff. Or it could be considered insensitive. I mean, like, what if someone came in and they'd been bitten by a snake? Are you just going to call them snake bite? I mean, Cliff does have the benefit of being an actual name, though, not like snake bite. But anyways, Lisa wants Nancy's help on this case. But according to Hannah Gruen, Nancy is already helping Carson with a case having to do with the River Heights Music Festival. Nancy is never content with just one mystery. She needs at least 2 at all times. But Nancy heads over to the hospital, where a man with a black beard shoves Nancy out of the way and snags the elevator before she can, which was super rude of him. But Lisa is waiting up on the upper floor when Nancy gets off the elevator, and she says the same rude man pushed past her. This guy is in a hurry for some reason, and they quickly find out why, because when they get to Cliff's room, the amnesia patient, they see the bearded man strangling Cliff and asking him about the ring he stole from him. So Nancy and Lisa confront the man, and he runs off, and Nancy takes the stairs to the lobby to try and bypass him since he takes the elevator, and she's just in time to see him leaving in a tan car with a blue racing stripe on it. The car unfortunately puts off a lot of exhaust, so she can't catch the license plate number, but it's a pretty distinctive car, so Nancy files that away in her Rolodex within her head. I just picture her having like this big file on her head where she's like got all this information for her cases. So next, Nancy calls Bess and George, and they come over to Rosemont Hospital, and they get Cliff's permission to look at the knapsack that was found with him. And it has average things in it, money, some clothes, but in a concealed pocket, Nancy finds an ornate gold ring. Maybe the ring that guy was strangling him over. It's not looking too good for Cliff right now. He's looking a bit like a thief. Not that it was right for that guy to strangle him, though, by any means. But Nancy says they should put the ring in the hospital safe for safekeeping. So Nancy's actually volunteering at the hospital, it turns out, and she's supposed to be taking flowers to people's rooms, and she notices that one bouquet is addressed for one of her neighbors, this kid named Tommy. So he was in some of the earlier books, like I mentioned before, but his mom says that a car pulled out in front of him on his bike and Tommy's leg is now broken. So next, Nancy tries to find Lisa, but someone says she went off duty, and when Nancy checks with a clerk, they say the ring isn't in the safe where they were going to put it. So Nancy heads for Lisa's house. She's really concerned about the fact that this ring could be missing, Lisa's gone, maybe something happened to her. So it turns out that Lisa took the ring to get looked at and appraised with Cliff's permission, and Nancy notices on her way there to this jewelry store where Lisa has gone to, an Indian man and the bearded strangler from the hospital are walking into the store right in front of her. So Nancy pulls into the jewelry store parking lot and she sees Lisa showing the ring to the Indian businessman and the shopkeeper, and Nancy sees the bearded stranger snatch the ring right out of her hands. So Nancy runs up to the door and slams the door into the man, knocking him off balance, and Lisa is able to get the ring back, and the shopkeeper grabs the bearded man. Meanwhile, the Indian businessman runs off and Nancy and Lisa chase after him, and he gets on a bus, but when they get the bus to stop, they flag the bus driver down. The man isn't on it and has simply disappeared. So this was just a crazy scene, and Nancy and Lisa, of course, they're trying to figure out what is so great about this ring, what is so valuable about it, and maybe it has some clues to who Cliff is, his identity, so they definitely don't want to lose it. So it's good that they got it back from that guy, but now they're kind of just wondering, when are they going to come back and try and steal it again? So the book says that Nancy double parked next to a police car and she ran over to Lisa and the policemen who were looking around the bus trying to figure out where that guy disappeared to, and Nancy says she should probably go talk to Chief McGinnis about this, and the policeman jokes that they'd rather not tow her car, and Nancy sheepishly says, "Sorry." I just found it funny that Nancy illegally parked because she never speeds, she never parks where she's not supposed to, so she was definitely more invested in catching this guy than caring about where her car was. So Chief McGinnis says that the description of the car that caused Tommy's accident matches the car that the bearded man got into, so the tan car with the blue racing stripes. So Nancy's like, okay, so not only did he pull in front of this child and cause him to break his leg, but he's involved in a lot of things trying to steal this ring. He's not a good person. Now at this point, Lisa insists that Nancy should keep the ring, which she says the jewelry store owner said was Asiatic in design. So Nancy takes it with her and hurries home, where Hannah was very worried about her. Now this next note is just something I took note of because I thought it was kind of interesting, but the book says Carson is in his 40s. At least from the books I've read, I don't think they've mentioned that before up to this point. So they usually just call him a distinguished lawyer, distinguished attorney. So I thought it was nice to get an exact age of Carson. I mean, I had figured he was older. I hadn't quite thought that he would be in his 50s, but he could have been. But I will say in some of these Wanderer editions, they do Carson dirty. Like, he looks so much older than he did in the original books. In the original books, he's got real slicked back hair. He looks very nice, very, distinguished. But anyway, just thought that was interesting. But Carson asks to talk to Nancy after dinner, and he tells her she may have to stop sleuthing for a little while because the people in a neighboring town, and it's called Castleton, are accusing Carson and River Heights of stealing a theater group they had booked for an event. So this is where the music festival plot comes into the mystery. And the book says Nancy is amazed because her father has never asked her to quit a case before she started. But Carson gives Nancy 2 complimentary tickets to the festival for her and Ned to use, and he says, don't do any sleuthing while you're there, but just go and enjoy it and have a good time. So how long do we think Nancy is going to take Carson's advice to heart? I give her until intermission. So next, Bess and George come over to Nancy's house, and they all examine this ring that Cliff had in his possession, and it has water lilies, a figure standing on a flower, and an initial that Nancy can't quite make out. They think that the ring warrants a second opinion, so they decide to return to the jewelry store again. And that night, Nancy has a dream that she's at the River Heights Theater, and someone on stage is throwing the ring at her, but her arms are held back by an imaginary rope, so she can't catch it. I like how in some of these later books they have Nancy having dreams and, they're giving her more unique thoughts. I think it's cool that they're developing her character in that way. I believe the first time we saw Nancy have like a really vivid dream was probably in the 99 Steps mystery. She dreamed about these people in like 17th, 18th century clothing running around, and there's bells going off, and it turns out to be an alarm in the house going off. So I think it's cool for them to do this with her character. It's just kind of a neat little touch. I think it makes Nancy seem more human, more real, because who hasn't had a weird dream? Like, I had a dream that my armpit fell off the other day. It was so random, and I woke up and I was like, what is happening? Needless to say, I will not be solving any mysteries anytime soon, except maybe the mystery of what the heck did I eat before I went to sleep that night, because okay. So Nancy actually oversleeps. I never thought I would see that because she usually gets up really early according to the books. Can't relate. But she has to go to the hospital and she doesn't have time to go to the jewelry store. So she gives the ring to Bess and George. She entrusts them with it and she's like, here, you guys take it. I'll go to the hospital and do my volunteer work. And the jeweler tells Bess and George that the ring almost looks like something that the Maharaja Prithviraj of Lakshmipur, I hope I'm saying this right, I am trying my best, but this guy could have owned it. So Bess and George leave the shop and they're followed by the strange bearded man who strangled Cliff at the hospital, and when they finally stop their car, he gets out and comes over and introduces himself as Dr. De Niro, an anthropologist. Now, the entire time that I was reading this, I was shouting in my head, Bess and George, don't listen to him, like, get back in the car, you never should have stopped, like, you should have done some kind of maneuver and, lost him. But George remembers seeing an article about this guy, Dr. De Niro, so she's like, oh, he's a professor, that's legit, he's just returned from Asia. So he asks to hold the ring and take a picture of it, and George lets him do it, which I was like, oh my gosh, George, why? But he says he wants to get in touch with the owner to ask them some questions, and the girls say, oh, well, he's in the hospital right now, but you can follow us there and you can talk to him. But the man suddenly says he has an appointment that he can't miss, and he runs off with the ring. So Bess and George try to flag him down like, oh, you forgot you're holding the ring, which he obviously did not forget. He planned it that way, but he takes off, and they remember him mentioning that he worked at Oberon College, so they decide to drive there. They're like, maybe we can get the ring back from him over there before Nancy knows what we did. So they wait outside his office, but another man shows up saying that he is Dr. De Niro. So the other man, the bearded man, was an imposter. Just great. And now he has the ring. So Bess and George go to Nancy and they confess that the ring is gone and that it's their fault, but she says it's okay, they'll get it back, and this was kind of sweet and heartwarming. She's like, I love you guys, it's okay, we'll figure it out. But she also says that Cliff has been having nightmares, and Nancy and the hospital staff think that he needs a better environment, so he's going to stay with the Drews apparently. So they're adopting this amnesiac. And it's funny because Nancy begins to worry that this will upset Ned, though, because he has made comments that Nancy has more time for mysteries than him lately. And Cliff is only a few years older than Ned, and according to the book, handsome. Now, I feel like this was just a plot point that they just kind of dropped into the book because they were like, let's create some drama between Nancy and Ned. Because up to this point, I think that Cliff has only been described as being unkempt, which, I mean, he fell off of a cliff, so of course we're going to give the guy some grace. But it's like they just decided, okay, he's going to be slightly older than Nancy and Ned, enough to be a potential romantic interest, but we're also going to say that he's handsome, just because. Also, this is kind of a plot hole for me. I just said we're just assuming that this guy's age is, slightly older than Nancy and Ned, because he hasn't told us the first thing about himself. We don't know his name, we don't know his age, and all of a sudden he's handsome, and no description of him being so up to this point has been made. But okay, we'll just go with it. But it is kind of funny because Ned is a little bit curt with Nancy when she says Cliff will be staying with them, but he and Nancy proceed to the theater with the tickets that Carson gave them. Ned's probably like, this guy gets to stay at the Drews' house and he has no memory or recollection of anything whatsoever, but I can't even get a date with Nancy where she isn't solving a mystery at the same time. Okay, but this next thing is crazy though, because there's a young red-headed harpist that comes onto the stage to perform, and Ned makes the joke, this is going to be more interesting than I thought. So I read this and I was like, no, he did not. Like, I think he was trying to make Nancy a little bit jealous here, and he obviously has a type, it seems. He likes the redheads. So Nancy and Ned also notice that the River Heights mayor snubs her, and people are whispering all around them about her father's allegations, like the fact that he stole this theater troupe from this other town, Castleton, but it's super awkward. This has made Nancy and Carson the talk of the town, but not in a good way. But before the show can even start, the harpist that's on the stage realizes that her harp is badly out of tune and someone has tampered with it. Seems a little bit like sabotage, but after the show, Nancy and Ned go talk to the harpist, and her name is Miss Pruitt, and she gives them an autograph, and Nancy notices that she signs it kind of stiffly, as if she's stressed or forging it, maybe. Okay, we have to talk about this next note though, because Ned makes a comment, and I know he's made some comments like this before, but he says he thought this would be a detectiveless evening, but this time he seemed genuinely annoyed with Nancy, which was kind of interesting. I feel like this is the start of trouble in paradise for them a little bit, at least in the original series. And this part is actually really real. It felt very real to me, but Nancy and Ned actually have an awkward argument in their car on the way to a diner after the concert, and Ned says he could use Nancy's help, and she asks him with what. But then all of a sudden Ned changes the subject and he says he would rather hear what's going on with Nancy, and they bicker back and forth until Nancy says, I'm sorry, I'm just overreacting about my dad. And Nancy then explains to Ned that she wants to help him and Carson won't let her, so she feels kind of useless. I kind of enjoyed this scene, not because Nancy and Ned were arguing, but just it felt very real. Nancy wants to help Carson and she doesn't know how, but her and Ned sit down at this old-fashioned diner and they joke about ordering a Tango Fandango, which is some massive ice cream sundae, but they order hot fudge instead, and they just kind of make up, and it just felt like, I don't know, just kind of a very realistic relationship moment. But Ned gives Nancy some advice, and he says she probably shouldn't go against Carson's wishes, but Nancy argues that he'll be alright if Ned's with her, and this makes Ned blush, but all is well in Nancy and Ned's relationship and in their world, at least for now, because I've heard some rumors that in some of the later books they, break up, get back together. I think it's mostly in the Nancy Drew files, but I don't know. We will see. So when Nancy and Ned get back to the Drews' house, Angela Pruitt, the harpist they met from the theater show, is there, and she says she actually does need Nancy's help. Her reputation precedes her. She is a very famous detective, but her sister Phyllis ran away to some spiritual camp just outside of River Heights some time ago, and Angela wants to find her. And when Angela had her last contact with Phyllis, she was staying with some people called the Flannerys. So the next day, Nancy brings Cliff home and gets a call from Angela, and she's just about to say where the camp is, but the line goes dead. And Nancy did hear her start to say the word lake, so she's like, maybe we can narrow it down to what the name of this town is. Also, we're solving 3 mysteries now. We don't just have to figure out what's going on with this theater group and Carson's case and this ring and this amnesia patient, but we are also trying to figure out where this long-lost sister is. So there's a lot going on. So Nancy and Ned head off to investigate lakes in the area, and they stop at a lodge near Swain Lake, and the owner of the lodge, Mr. Keshav Lal, asks if they are looking for Ramaswamy when they mention the retreat, this spiritual camp. But while they're talking, a man comes up and he's frustrated because his phone calls aren't going through, and his name is Mr. Flannery. Mr. Flannery of the Flannerys, who were housing Phyllis Pruitt, Angela's sister. Nancy also says that the man seems very familiar to her, but she asks if he knows Phyllis Pruitt, and he says no. He's honestly pretty rude, but they do get some directions to a cabin nearby from Mr. Law. So Nancy and Ned set off on this trail, and they get soaked by the rain. So they stop at this cabin, and the woman that lives there says that the camp is further down the trail, but before they go too much further, Nancy feels herself being grabbed, drugged, and then she passes out. So you may be wondering, what are Bess and George up to at this point in the mystery? So meanwhile, Bess and George have gone to visit Cliff at the Drews' house, but he's disappeared while Hannah was out getting groceries. If you thought that this family could babysit an amnesiac, you were severely mistaken. And I don't know, the whole time I keep talking about amnesia patients, I can't help but think of Henrik van der Heun in the Secret of the Scarlet Hand game. I can't remember. So Bess and George argue back and forth about calling the police, with Bess being for it and George being against it. And George reasons, she's like, well, maybe Cliff will come back. Maybe he just walked outside and he'll come right back. But Bess says, what if you're wrong? And George says, if I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. And then Bess says, that's the craziest logic I've ever heard. This does seem like an argument that they would have, though. But meanwhile, Nancy wakes up from passing out, and she's tied up in a cabin, and a water snake is crawling towards her. This made my skin crawl because I don't like snakes. But she somehow manages to kick up a loose floorboard, and the snake falls through and underneath the house. So I was like, yay, go Nancy. Now, back at the Drews, because it keeps bouncing between the perspectives here, Bess, George, and Hannah talk to a police officer. They finally came to an agreement, and he comes by and he finds a drop of chloroform on the floor and a hole in the screen door, which is how the people got in, and Cliff must have been drugged, according to him. So he must have been kidnapped, I guess, and I can just picture Bess being like, I told you so, George. So Nancy at this point is trying to weaken the ties on her hands and feet on a nail in the cabin, but she's eventually saved by Ned, who was also tied up in another cabin a few yards away. So they head back to the lodge, and they're told by someone at the reception desk that Mr. Law is gone and won't be back for a few days. And I was like, well, that's real convenient. He told you to go over to this cabin, and then you get knocked out and tied up, and then he's just mysteriously gone afterwards. I wonder who did this to you. So Nancy and Ned get back to the Drews' house, and they are informed that Cliff is missing and was probably kidnapped. So Nancy decides to interview the neighbors, and a boy next door says he saw a striped car leave their house, and he happened to get the license number. So she gives that to the police, and they say it's registered to a man named Dev Singh. Now, I don't know why the police didn't just do this. Like, this seems like part of their job, but Nancy's the expert here. No question about it. But the next morning, Nancy sees a piece of mail from the River Heights Theater saying the shows are canceled. This is kind of strange because the shows were all sold out, and Nancy's a little bit suspicious about this, so she goes down to the theater and talks to the manager, Mr. Hillier, but he gets really cold towards Nancy when she says who she is. She says, I'm Nancy Drew, and then he clams up and he's like, I don't want to talk to you anymore. This turns out to be a hoax, though, and Nancy has to wonder, why would somebody send this out to tell people, like, hey, you bought all these tickets, but now the show is not going to be put on? Like, somebody is sabotaging this theater show for one reason or another. So next, Bess and George have this idea that maybe the bearded ring thief would be greedy enough to answer an ad in the paper for a lot of money in return for the ring, and they think, oh, we can get the ring back, it'll make everything better. So they go back to Mr. Javari's jewelry store. So they ask him for a ballpark figure, like how much the ring would be worth, and then Nancy notices that there's a picture of Keshav Lal in Mr. Javari's office, which is a little bit weird to her. So Nancy casually asks him, she's like, oh, who's that a picture of? And he says, oh, that's my cousin. Suspicious. So after this trip to the jewelry store, Nancy decides to take Bess and George to Dev Singh's address, the guy who owns the tan car with the blue racing stripes. And at first, they go to the wrong place, which is someplace called Hamburger Haven, some restaurant. And Nancy's like, oh, whoops, it was River Lane, not River Drive. But I think that the book makes a mistake, though, because Nancy is driving her car, and then a sentence later it says she jogged down the street. So she parked her car pretty fast. But they end up at the right address eventually, and they hear noises inside, so Nancy's convinced that Cliff is in there, that the kidnappers took him and he's here at Dev Singh's house, but no one answers when they knock on the door. But then a car starts up the driveway and they run to hide. They actually have to hide Nancy's car, so they do that really quickly. But then there's a man that shows up in a business suit, and his name is Flannery. He turns out to be the bearded man who stole the ring also. He's one and the same. And then the tall Indian man who first came into Mr. Javari's shop shows up. So Nancy, Bess, and George speed down the street in the car once the men go in the house, and they call the police. And then they go knock on the door, and the Indian man answers, saying his name is Prem Nath. So he says that nobody by the name of Cliff is there, and the police show up, they search, but they find no evidence of wrongdoing, so they just have to leave. Also, if you're having trouble keeping up with all these names and people and aliases and all this stuff, you're not the only one. So the next thing to happen in this mystery is Nancy later stops at Rosemont Hospital, and Lisa says someone claiming to be Cliff called and said something about singing, but it was unclear. And so Nancy's like, maybe he said Dev Singh, and Lisa misheard him. Nancy's now convinced more than ever that Cliff is at Dev Singh's house. So next, Nancy takes a brief break from sleuthing, but not really, because she, Ned, Bess, Dave, Bert, and George go to a showing of Oklahoma at the theater, and there aren't many people there. And so Nancy's afraid that a lot of people thought that the cancellation letter was real, even though it was a hoax. So whoever sent that flyer out really hurt the attendance for the musical. So the play starts, but the lights are red and creepy, and Nancy runs backstage and catches a man leaving the sound booth. And the real technician is just laying on the soundboard and was hit over the head. Yep, that looks like sabotage to me. But the festival manager comes in, and he thinks that Nancy hit the guy over the head. Poor Nancy, she can't catch a break. She insists that there was another man and he ran off, but nobody believes her. So the next day, Nancy talks to Angela Pruitt again, the lady that plays the harp, and she says she heard from Phyllis. And Nancy asks how she contacted her, and Angela says she wrote a note saying to meet her at Swain Lodge. So Angela tells Nancy that she went and showed up, but Phyllis never came. So she goes to check at the desk, and there's a phone message from Phyllis saying she couldn't come, but Nancy says it could have been someone else trying to lure Angela there. So next, Nancy and Ned go to the Flannerys, and Miss Flannery says that Phyllis has been gone for about a week, and she's reluctant to let them in, but eventually she does. So Nancy looks in Phyllis's room where she was staying, and she can tell that she left in a hurry, and she sees a pamphlet, so she picks it up. But Miss Flannery acts weird and tries to get the pamphlet back from Nancy so she can't see it, but Nancy insists. And it's a pamphlet about Ramaswamy and his spiritual retreat. So Nancy also sees in the room where Phyllis started a letter to Angela, but she never finished it, which is odd. She sure finished that note to Angela when she went to Swain Lodge, so it's almost like Phyllis was abducted or something. So Nancy and Ned next go to visit Dr. De Niro, the professor at Oberon College, and he says he was shipped a mysterious package, and in it is the missing ring that they've been looking for this entire time. So at least we have that back, and he gives it to Nancy to take because he's like, this isn't rightfully mine. I want you to give this back to the original owner. So as Nancy and Ned leave his office, Nancy spots the guy who knocked the sound technician out. So they follow him back to the theater, and Nancy tries to tell Mr. Hillier. She says this guy is guilty, but he doesn't believe her. I've got to say, it's pretty annoying when people don't believe Nancy. But meanwhile, Hannah Gruen tells Nancy that Cliff might have been spotted hitchhiking in the area, and she says she hopes it's him because she wants to make him a coconut layer cake by way of apology. Poor Hannah Gruen. I mean, she was just going to the Piggly Wiggly. She didn't mean to lose the amnesia patient. I would take a coconut layer cake as an apology. That would be pretty cool. But Nancy and Ned set out to spy on the Flannerys next, and little do they know, the man who knocked out the sound technician followed them to the Flannerys. This mystery is so twisty and convoluted, but Nancy and Ned stand below the kitchen window at the house, and they hear the Flannerys talking about dumping Nancy at the lake if she intervenes again. Yikes. So then the guy who followed them, the one who knocked out the sound technician that time, knocks Ned out, and then he goes after Nancy. And so the commotion brings the Flannerys outside, and they grab Nancy, tie her up, and they shove a piece of bread in her mouth. Super rude, I have to say, but Ned wakes up a few hours later. He's like down for the count for a while, but he doesn't know where Nancy is. So the boy who attacked to Nancy and Ned. We finally know his name. It is Brady, and he's back at the theater, and he releases a scorpion into the audience because he's just such a nice guy. So, of course, the people in the audience panic, and then the theater empties out, and Mr. Hillier has to fill out an accident report. And Brady pretends to be concerned about it. He's like, oh, what happened? Where are all these people going? They ran off. I don't know what's going on. So he says that his dad does sound at the Castleton Theater, and he asks if the theater troupe will go back there. So now we know his motivations here. He's trying to get his dad a job. He's trying to get him work again, essentially. So now the book jumps back to Ned's perspective, and he has found a trail of breadcrumbs, but no sign of Nancy. And he sees that he has a flat tire on his car, and so he has to go inflate that. But he goes to the Drews' house, and Hannah says that Carson is at the police department. So Ned shows up at the police department, and Mr. Hillier is there, and he's accusing Carson of having the scorpion and putting it out in the audience, which is so funny to me, just a picture. But Ned explains to Carson that he thinks Brady is sabotaging the theater, but they need more proof, and not to mention they need to find Nancy. I'm sorry, I keep thinking about Carson setting that scorpion loose in the auditorium, just like Carson Drew, distinguished lawyer, scorpion owner. It sounds ridiculous. But Ned, Carson, Angela, Bert, Dave, Bess, and George, that's a lot of people, go to find Nancy, who they think is at the Swami retreat. So they have to hike through the woods to get to this place because, of course, all spiritual retreats have to be out in the middle of nowhere. You know, it's just an unwritten law somewhere. And Bess says she should have worn better shoes, and George says, well, you should have thought of that. And then Bess retorts that she can't think of everything, which I just thought was such a Bess answer. She's like, George, get off my back. Like, our best friend has been kidnapped. I can't think about sensible shoes right now. But it was kind of funny because Dave interrupts them arguing, and he says, it seems to me that you two enjoy picking on each other. And Bess says, we're not picking on each other. George is merely looking out for my best interest. Oh, is that what we're calling it now? Okay. But they all find the cabin with Dev Singh's car sitting outside, the one that's tan with blue racing stripes, and they find Prim Nath, Mr. Javeri, the jewelry store owner, Flannery, and Keshav Lal. But Nancy ties Miss Flannery up with a tablecloth in order to get away from her, and I thought this was just funny. But they find Phyllis and Cliff also there, who says his name is Randy, and he's suddenly regained his memory, magically, at the end of the book. Mr. Javeri had no idea what his cousin was doing, Keshav Lal. He's like, I had no idea he had any part in these wrongdoings. But Prim Nath is actually Dev Singh and falsified his immigration card, according to the book. And in the beginning of the book, Cliff/Randy was jumped by Lal and Singh, and he hit his head, so that's how he lost his memory. Also, you may be wondering, did Randy actually own the ring? So yes, Randy actually owned the ring. That was his. And Lal was intercepting these valuable gifts to Ramaswamy and selling them at his cousin Javari's shop. And then the book ends with Brady confessing, the kid who knocked out the sound technician, confessing that he sabotaged the theater, including the scorpion. And then there's just a celebratory dinner at the end with Tommy, Lisa, and Randy, who was once named Cliff. This was such a crazy book. But now let's go on to the What's Cooking segment of this episode. So we got mentionings of peach pie, orange juice, hot fudge sundaes, and tea, tarts, and noodles. Now on to the segment that I like to call Add That to Your Resume. Now, I said that Nancy could be a candy striper since she was volunteering at the hospital and delivering flowers. Now on to the things I liked and didn't like about the Swami's ring. So this book was full of great writing. There was a lot of good details, and we learned a little bit. You know, we saw Bess and George poking fun at each other. I really enjoyed those aspects of this book, but the things I didn't like, it was kind of convoluted. I know you could probably tell as I was trying to explain some of it to you guys. It was just like, this guy had an alias and this guy had an alias, and it was just a lot. So I think for that reason, I would probably give the Swami's ring a 2 magnifying glass rating. It's just not going to be in my top 10 Nancy Drew books. So for next week's episode, we're going to take a break from the books and jump into the Nancy Drew Her Interactive Computer Games again. We're going to be discussing game number 5, The Final Scene. So if you like kidnappings, please say you don't like kidnappings. Kidnappings are bad. Nobody should like kidnappings. But if you like old dilapidated theaters and mysteries that are just very high stakes, then you will enjoy this episode. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.